Think back to Saturday, September 8th, 1900. Not a holiday, not a battlefield. Just a late summer Saturday in Texas. The kind of day that feels ordinary enough to trust. Texas was stepping into a new century as a young giant, wide, restless, and still mostly rural. The 1900 census counted about 3,048,710 people across a state so big that going to town could mean hours of dust before you ever saw a roofline. Most wealth still came from things you could grow, cut, or drive. Cotton moved out by the bale, cattle moved out by the rail car, lumber rolled down from East Texas pines. Railroads stitched the distances together, turning empty miles into schedules, markets, and momentum. Oil existed, but it was not yet the story Texans told about themselves. The spindle-top gusher that would change everything was still months away. The boom was coming, but on September 8th, 1900, Texas still looked toward ports, trains, and harvests for its future. And at the edge of that future sat Galveston, a wealthy port city on a thin barrier island, lit by electric lamps and confidence. Streetcars clanged down wide streets, grand hotels filled with late summer guests. The Strand glittered with money and ambition. Galveston had grown on the strength of its port, cotton moving outward, immigrants and supplies coming in, the island acting like a front door to Texas. By 1900, the city had about 37,788 people. And even as other Texas cities grew faster, Galveston still carried itself like the place that mattered. And out beyond the horizon, the Gulf of Mexico was assembling the kind of consequence that does not care what a city believes about itself. By nightfall, the air would turn violent. Wind would scream through rooftops and down alleyways, but the true villain would be the water, storm surge climbing past streets and doorways until an island stopped being a place you lived and became a place you tried to survive. Around 8:01 p.m., the great Galveston hurricane came ashore as a Category 4 storm, driving a storm surge of more than 15 feet into the city. Winds climbed above 130 miles per hour. More than 3,600 buildings were destroyed, and at least 8,000 people would die. And the cruelest part is this. In 1900, there were no satellites, no radar, and no wireless ship-to-shore warnings. If the storm was growing stronger out over open water, it was doing it in silence. This was the Great Galveston Hurricane of 1900, the deadliest weather disaster in United States history. Around 8,000 lives lost, with estimates that stretch from roughly 6,000 to 12,000, depending on which records survived and which names vanished with the buildings. And it did not arrive like a monster you could see from far away. It arrived like a rumor, like a heavy mood in the sky, like something you could ignore, right up until there was nothing left to do but hold on. The morning began the way most mornings begin when a city thinks it is safe. In Galveston, nearly 38,000 people woke up to a rain-darkened, gusty Saturday and treated it like weather. Not prophecy, not a warning siren, just a messy day on the Gulf. Shopkeepers opened shutters, dock workers reported for their shifts, horses pulled wagons over streets still dusted with sand. In boarding houses and rented rooms, visitors dressed for breakfast. In kitchens, coffee boiled. Screen doors slapped and bounced in the wind. Down by the waterline, the waves were already wrong. Not just higher, longer, heavier. The kind of swell that looks slow until it hits, and then you realize it carries weight. And if you wanted to know what was happening, you read the paper. On page 3 of the local daily news, there was a one-column headline, "Storm in the Gulf." Under it, a smaller line that should have sounded louder than it did. Wires down, details meager, one paragraph, almost no specifics, a hint of damage farther east. Then a sentence that felt like permission to relax. The kind of sentence people cling to when they want fear to stay small. Maybe the disturbance had changed course. Maybe it had spent its force before reaching Texas. So the city kept moving. And that is the thing about 1900. Out at sea, where hurricanes grow teeth, ships had no way to send real-time observations back to shore. What people knew came through telegraph wires and best guesses. And that day the guesses were wrong, partly because the information was thin, and partly because the system that carried it moved slowly, carefully, and sometimes politically. Cuban meteorologists had been studying hurricanes for decades. They saw danger in the storm's track into the Gulf. But in the United States, storm information filtered through layers that could delay warnings and soften language. And some accounts describe U.S. officials restricting direct communication from Havana to Gulf Coast offices. So Galveston, rich, proud, and used to overflows, did what humans often do with unfamiliar danger. They normalized it. By afternoon, the storm was still something most people talked about. But inside the Weather Bureau office, it was becoming something you measured. A man named John D. Blagden was there on temporary assignment. He had only been in town 2 weeks, filling in for someone on leave. He was not a lifelong Galvestonian. He did not have the island's casual confidence. He was a trained observer, watching the sky and watching the instruments, while outside the city kept pretending it was just another rough day on the Gulf. Blagden stayed in the office all night. He would later say the building held better than most, even as it rocked under the blasts, like a ship taking hits in the dark. And while he listened to the wind climb in pitch and anger, the part of the city where he rented a room, the south end, began to disappear. 2 days later, on September 10th, he sat down and wrote a 7-page letter to his family in Duluth, Minnesota. He did not start with drama. He started with disbelief. "Very probably you little expect a letter from here," he wrote, "but here I am alive and without a scratch." Then he wrote the sentence that tells you what kind of storm this was. "The family with whom I roomed were all lost." He had lost his clothes, his belongings, and a little money. He called himself among the fortunate ones because he was still breathing. And then he wrote about his boss. Dr. Isaac Klein, the chief meteorologist at Galveston, lived in the same southern part of the city. When the water came up, people ran to Klein's house because it was known as one of the strongest. Dozens packed inside it, betting their lives on lumber and nails. The bet failed. Blagden wrote that the Klein house collapsed, and they were out in the wreckage nearly all night. Klein's wife was killed. The children were saved, barely. Then comes the line that lands like a door shutting. Of the 40-odd who took refuge there, less than 20 are now living. This is where the story stops being about a storm and becomes about a city getting erased, one address at a time. Blagden survived the night because the Weather Bureau office stayed standing. But the most final image he leaves you with is not wind. It is the south end of the city swept clean. Whole streets erased, whole families gone. If you want to understand why Galveston lost so many people, you have to understand this. Wind terrifies you in a straightforward way. It screams. It breaks things you can see. It feels like an enemy you can brace against. Water is different. Water is patient. Water does not roar until it is already inside your street. It does not threaten. It simply rises. And when it rises in a storm tide, it rises with physics, not emotion. And here was Galveston's problem. The island it sat on was low. Not low like a neighborhood at the bottom of a hill. Low like a place where the difference between your front steps and the Gulf is a few feet and a bad decision. In 1900, the highest point in the city was only about 8.7 feet above sea level. The highest point, the best case. Now put that next to what the storm brought. Historic summaries describe storm tides in the 8 to 15-foot range washing over the island. Local high water marks reached about 15.7 feet. On an island whose best ground is 8.7, that is not flooding. That is the sea taking the ground back. And once the water is higher than the highest place you can run to, the storm stops being weather. It becomes a countdown. In Galveston, that countdown started quietly. By midday, the sky had the color of dirty cotton. Rain came in the steady pulses. The wind increased, then increased again. The Gulf pushed higher onto the beaches, then onto the roads like it was testing where the city would say no. By early afternoon, water was already creeping into the low spots. People stepped onto porches and watched the streets go slick. Some laughed nervously, like the ocean was just being dramatic. Others did the small, sensible things you do in normal high water. Lifting rugs, putting valuables on tables, moving chairs. Small actions meant for small floods. But this was not normal flooding. Inside the Weather Bureau office, Blagden kept watching and measuring, listening to the buildings shift under the gusts. And his chief, Dr. Isaac Klein, was watching too, not from a distance, but from the streets. The tide was higher than it should be. The swells were wrong. The air felt wrong. Klein raised hurricane warning flags. Then he did something that sounds almost impossible now. He hitched a horse to a cart and drove through the lowest parts of the city, telling people to get out, telling them to move to higher ground while there was still time. But Galveston was confident. It had seen overflows before. It had survived storms before. It had been rebuilt before. And there is a limit to how urgent a warning can feel when the last storm you lived through taught you that you will live through the next one too. Then the connections started to fail. Telegraph lines went down. Information stopped moving. The rails and bridges that made Galveston feel connected to Texas began to feel like thin threads. And as wind and water worked on those threads, the island started to close like a fist. By mid-afternoon, the wind had its own voice now. Higher pitched, angrier. It found corners and made them scream. Windows rattled, shutters banged, roofs began to lose shingles. Somewhere a sign tore loose and skated down a street like a runaway blade. And then came the sound that people near the beach never forget. Not surf, not weather. A constant, heavy pounding. The ocean hitting the city like it meant it. The storm tide began to make the island smaller. Not all at once. Not in a single cinematic wall. At first, it came in increments that were easy to underestimate. A little more water in the street, one more step up the porch, another block that turned impassable. That is the genius of storm surge as a killer. It offers you time, but the time is deceptive. You think you have a margin, you think you can wait and see, and then suddenly you cannot. From about 3 p.m. to around 7:30 p.m., the water kept rising. Steady, relentless. The kind of rise that convinces you it will stay manageable, because it has been manageable for the last hour. Then, according to an eyewitness account preserved in the Weather Bureau and NOAA historical summaries, there was a moment when the water jumped about 4 feet in as many seconds. 4 feet in the time it takes to inhale. That is not a flood. That is a trap snapping shut. Imagine being inside a house when that happens. The floor is dry, then wet, then moving. Furniture does not drift. It lifts and slams as waves shove through rooms that were never meant to have current. Doors that open inward become impossible to open because water pressure pins them shut. And outside, debris begins to travel. Planks, boards, shingles, pieces of other people's homes, turning into battering rams. The storm did not just rise, it armed itself. And once debris starts to move, the storm changes shape. Galveston was a city of wood, warm porches, pine framing, fast-built houses packed close together. It was the kind of construction that made a coastal city feel alive. But in a storm tide, wood becomes fuel. Because the first building that fails does not just disappear. It breaks apart. It floats. It travels. And then it hits the next building like a battering ram. One collapse feeds the next collapse until the disaster starts multiplying itself, block by block. By early evening, the wind was tearing at everything that was not nailed down and then tearing at the things that were. On the levee building, the Weather Bureau instruments began to fail. The rain gauge blew down around mid-afternoon. The barometer fell fast. And at 5:15 p.m., the anemometer blew away. Shortly after recording average winds of 84 miles an hour and gusts of 100. After that, the numbers disappear. What remains are descriptions, timbers, bricks, slate, heavy debris flying almost horizontally through the air. And this is why rescue ends before the storm does. You cannot send help into a city where the streets are water, the air is missiles, and the shoreline is moving. And here is the line that turns everything colder. In a disaster like this, the danger is not one thing. It is everything. It is wind ripping apart his shelter while water erases the ground. It is debris turning streets into weapons. It is darkness stealing orientation. It is isolation sealing the island shut. Then night came down, and Galveston stopped being a city you recognized. Streets were no longer lines you followed. They were currents. The sound of the Gulf swallowed other sounds. A violent roar that made it impossible to judge distance or direction. Wind-driven rain cut sideways, stinging skin, blinding eyes, turning every attempt to move into a negotiation with forces that did not respond. This was the hour when the storm stopped being something you endured and became something you survived minute by minute. Inside the Weather Bureau office, Blagden stayed where the walls were thicker and the windows were fewer. The building held, but it did not feel solid. It moved, it swayed. And outside, the city was coming apart in pieces he could hear but could not see. Some people tried to climb into attics. Some broke through ceilings because the attic was the last pocket of air. Others clung to rafters as waves punched through walls, turning houses into hollow frames. In larger buildings, people pressed together on upper floors and listened to impacts below. Every impact sounded like the end, because sometimes it was. And then the city began to break in chains. The storm lifted debris from one row of buildings and hurled it against the next. Porches became battering rams. Roof beams became spears. Whole sections of houses traveled together like a moving wall. By the end, roughly 2/3 of Galveston's buildings were damaged or destroyed. Thousands of homes and structures were simply gone. You do not need graphic detail to understand the scale of loss. The numbers alone tell you how complete the destruction was. Around 8,000 dead is the most cited figure, with estimates that range from roughly 6,000 to 12,000. Entire families vanished. Entire neighborhoods ceased to exist. Names disappeared because the records that held them disappeared too. And in the middle of that night, tragedy did not arrive as one clean moment. It arrived as thousands of endings happening at once in the dark. Afterward, there were stories that became symbols, places where the storm's cruelty was concentrated into something people could point to and say, "This is what happened to us." One of them was an orphanage on the west end of the island. St. Mary's Orphanage held nearly 100 children and the sisters caring for them. When the storm tide came up, the building did not negotiate. It did not compromise. It failed. All 10 sisters drowned. Only 3 of the orphanage's children survived. A building that, in normal weather, would have felt safe. In a storm tide like this, safety was an illusion. And then there was Dr. Isaac Klein. He had raised warning flags. He had urged people to move away from the beach. His home was considered one of the strongest in that part of town, and people crowded into it for refuge. And still, his house collapsed. Klein survived with his children, but he lost his wife. Because when the sea rises over the highest ground, it does not matter what you believe. It matters where you are. Sometime later in the night, the storm reached a cruel equilibrium, the point where the water had risen enough to cover nearly everything it was going to cover. Not because the danger was done, but because there was nothing left at ground level to take. From that point on, survival depended on height, strength, and luck. Then slowly, almost imperceptibly, the Gulf began to withdraw. Not like a curtain lifting, like a breath being released after a long scream. The wind eased by degrees. The pounding softened. The water receded, leaving behind a city that no longer looked like itself. When daylight came on September 9th, it revealed a scene that defied comparison. Where streets had been, there were channels filled with debris. Where blocks of homes had stood, there were open spaces littered with wreckage. Ships sat where they did not belong. Lumber was everywhere, stacked in chaotic piles by the retreating water, like the Gulf had tried to build its own city out of splinters. And then came the work that survivors still described as the hardest part. Not the fear during the storm, the days after. because now the city had to do impossible things with limited tools. The dead were so numerous that traditional burial quickly became impossible. Bodies were taken out to sea, others were burned where they lay, not for spectacle, not for story, because there was no other way to keep disease from joining the disaster. Survivors helped survivors. They pulled strangers from wreckage. They shared food. They turned anything still standing into shelter. The instinct to help did not wait for permission. It happened because it had to. Relief from the mainland arrived as soon as conditions allowed. Boats crossed debris-choked water. Doctors and volunteers stepped into a place that felt less like a city and more like an aftermath. A relief committee formed almost immediately to organize food, shelter, and medical care, because waiting for help was not an option. And as news spread across the country, the questions followed, fast and furious. How could this happen? Why wasn't there more warning? Why was a thriving modern city built so vulnerable? Why did so many stay? The answer is not one thing. It is everything. It is a barrier island built low and flat. It is a culture of confidence that had survived smaller storms and mistook survival for invincibility. It is an era before modern hurricane science treated storm surge as the headline killer. It is a world where information moved through wires that snapped, through forecasts that softened language, through systems that did not yet have the tools to see what was coming. After Galveston, the country could not pretend coastal water was just scenery. The city faced a choice: abandon the island or change it. And Galveston chose change. A board of engineers recommended a massive concrete seawall, curved to absorb force, rising to about 17 feet above mean low water and stretching for miles along the Gulf front. Construction began in the early 1900s, and the wall became a statement written in concrete. But a wall alone would not fix a city built too low. So Galveston did something that still sounds impossible. It raised the city itself, blocks at a time, sections enclosed by dikes, buildings lifted on jack screws while sand was pumped beneath them. Streetcar tracks, fire plugs, and water lines were raised with the neighborhoods they served. Thousands of structures were lifted, and millions of cubic yards of sand were moved to change the island's elevation. People kept living in their homes while the work happened, walking to and from on boardwalks fastened to fence tops, because even rebuilding had to be survived day by day. It was a declaration made in sweat and engineering. Never again. And that decision did not just reshape Galveston. It reshaped how Americans thought about coastal cities, about preparedness, about what it means to live near water that can rise. Today, when you see a hurricane track days in advance, when warnings tell you to leave before the wind arrives, when emergency managers repeat the same message about storm surge, that language was bought with stories like Galveston, not because Galveston was the first storm, but because it was the storm that proved, beyond argument, what the sea can do when the sea decides to take the land back. Galveston rebuilt. Life returned. Streetcars rang again. Lights came back. But ask the families who lived through it, or the children who grew up hearing the stories, and they will tell you what never left. They will tell you about the roar that swallowed the city. They will tell you about morning light falling on wreckage where neighborhoods used to be. They will tell you about wagons passing in the street again and again, because there were too many names to carry any other way. And they will tell you the lesson that sits beneath every coastal forecast, every evacuation map, every seawall and raised foundation. A modern city can feel permanent, right up until the day it isn't. If your family has a Galveston story, if you have heard it passed down, if you have stood on that seawall and tried to imagine what the island looked like before it existed, share it in the comments below.